My mother called me the spare in front of 40 people. She had no idea I paid for the dinner, or that I owned the building, and carried a document that could take away everything.
My mother called me the spare in front of 40 people. She had no idea the quiet man in the corner had paid for the dinner, owned the building where my brother planned to become CEO, and carried a document that could take away everything she thought belonged to her. Hello. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 38 years old, and for most of my life, my family treated me like the understudy in a play that had only one real star. That star was my older brother, Daniel. The night he came home to Richmond, Virginia, my mother rented the private dining room at Bellwether House, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. White roses covered the tables. A string quartet played near the windows. Gold letters above the fireplace read, Melcombe Donnell. There was no mention of why he had come home. His company in Chicago had forced him to resign after 3 years of terrible decisions. He had lost 2 major clients, spent company money on luxury travel, and blamed his staff when the board started asking questions. Mother called it burnout. She told everyone Daniel had sacrificed his health to become a great leader. According to her, Richmond was lucky to have him back. I knew the truth because one of his former directors had called me 2 weeks earlier. Daniel had listed me as an emergency reference without asking. The director did not want gossip. She wanted to know whether Daniel had ever received treatment for what she politely called unstable judgment. I said no. Then I listened while she described his final month at the company. He had promised money that did not exist, threatened an accountant, and tried to erase emails before an internal audit. I had not told Mother. There was no point. In her eyes, facts that embarrassed Daniel were acts of cruelty. At the dinner, she seated him at the center of the long table. She placed me near the kitchen door, beside a cousin I had not seen in 12 years. My place card did not even say Claire. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed quietly. Across the room, a man named Thomas Reed watched me. He was 71, silver-haired, and dressed in a plain charcoal suit. Most of the guests assumed he was an accountant or an old family friend. They were partly right. Thomas had been my late father's closest business partner. He was also the trustee of the Bennett Family Trust, though Mother had spent 15 years pretending that trust did not matter. He lifted his water glass slightly when our eyes met. It was not a greeting. It was a question. Are you ready? I gave him the smallest nod. For 6 months, Thomas and I had been preparing for that evening. Mother believed the dinner was Daniel's first step toward taking control of Bennett Architectural Supply, the company my father had built from a warehouse with a leaking roof. She did not know the trust owned 62% of it. She also did not know my father had left strict instructions about who could control those shares. Dinner began with champagne and stories about Daniel's childhood. Mother told everyone he had spoken in complete sentences at 18 months. My aunt said he had always been destined for greatness. Daniel smiled as if he were accepting an award. No one mentioned that I had spent the previous 7 years keeping our family company alive. When Dad died, the company was drowning in debt. Our biggest supplier had sued us. 2 banks refused to extend our credit. Daniel was in Chicago then, posting photographs from rooftop bars and telling Mother he was too busy to come home. I came home. I negotiated with the supplier, sold my townhouse, and worked 14-hour days. I learned every contract, every warehouse route, and every employee's name. By the end of the 2nd year, we were profitable again. Mother still introduced me as the girl who helped with paperwork. Halfway through dinner, Daniel tapped his knife against his glass. He announced that he would soon bring modern leadership to the family company. A few relatives clapped. Mother pressed both hands to her heart. Then Daniel looked toward me. Claire has kept the chair warm, he said. I appreciate that, but the company needs someone who understands growth. The room filled with careful laughter. I felt the old anger rise, but I did not answer. I looked at Thomas instead. He calmly signed the restaurant receipt the waiter had placed beside him. Mother stood for her toast. She raised her champagne glass and looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. She said, "The child who gave our family a future." Everyone lifted a glass. Then she turned to me. Her smile was gentle enough to fool a stranger. She added, "Every family needs a spare, someone dependable who can stand in until the real heir comes home." The laughter was quieter this time. Some guests looked down. Others watched me, waiting to see if I would cry. I placed my napkin beside my plate and stood. "Thank you, Mother," I said. "That makes what happens next much easier." Daniel's smile disappeared. Before Mother could speak, Thomas closed the leather folder beside his chair. "Evelyn," he said, "you should sit down. The bill is paid, but the cost of this evening is only beginning." Mother stared at Thomas as if a chair had spoken. "This is a family celebration," she said. "Whatever business you have can wait." "It has waited 15 years, Thomas replied. Richard made certain it would not wait one day longer. The sound of my father's name changed the room. Dad had died when I was 23 and Daniel was 26. Officially, it was a heart attack. He had collapsed at his desk late one October evening. For years, Mother told us his final concern had been Daniel's future. She repeated the story so often that it became family scripture. But 6 months before the welcome home dinner, Thomas had called me into his office. He showed me a sealed letter written in my father's hand. On the envelope were the words for Claire, "When Daniel asks to control the company." My hands had shaken as I opened it. Dad's letter was not sentimental. It was precise. He wrote that he loved both of his children, but love was not the same as trust. Daniel was charming, hungry for approval, and careless with anything he believed could be replaced. Dad had caught him using a company credit card to pay gambling debts when he was 24. Mother had begged Dad to hide it. Dad did. Then Daniel did it again. The second time, he forged Dad's signature on a loan application. If the bank had approved it, the company warehouse would have become collateral for a private investment Daniel barely understood. Dad stopped the loan and created the Bennett Family Trust. The trust held the controlling shares of the company, the family estate on Monument Avenue, and 2 commercial properties. Mother received income and the right to live in the house. She did not receive ownership. Daniel could earn a leadership role only after 10 years of clean financial conduct and approval from an independent board. I had a different condition. If I worked for the company for 5 years and restored it to stable profit, voting control would pass to me. I had completed that condition 2 years earlier. Thomas had delayed the formal transfer because of one final instruction. Dad wanted the truth, revealed only if Daniel openly claimed the company or Mother publicly declared him the rightful heir. That night, they had done both. Back in the restaurant, Thomas removed 3 documents from his folder. Mother looked at me. "You planned this?" "No," I said. "Dad planned it. I just stopped protecting you from it." Daniel stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. "This is ridiculous. Dad wanted me to run the company. Everyone knows that." Thomas slid a photocopy of the trust across the table. "Your father wanted you to become a man capable of running it," he said. "That is not the same thing." Daniel did not read the document. He pushed it away. Then Mother made her first mistake. She said, "The trust was dissolved years ago." Thomas became very still. "Why would you believe that?" Mother's face lost its color. "It was only one sentence, but I heard the secret inside it." Thomas heard it too. He asked again, "Who told you the trust was dissolved?" Mother reached for her glass, but her hand missed it. "We have documents." The room seemed to shrink. I had expected anger, denial, perhaps a dramatic exit. I had not expected documents. Thomas asked Daniel to show them. Daniel smiled. It was the smile he used when he believed everyone else was slow. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I am filing the amended trust and accepting my appointment as chief executive. Claire can remain in operations if she behaves professionally." Thomas looked at me. For the first time that night, he seemed worried. Mother had not merely planned to humiliate me. She and Daniel believed they had found a legal way to steal control. "Then tomorrow morning," I said, "we should all meet at the company. Bring every document you have." Mother laughed, relieved that the public confrontation appeared to be ending. "Good, we will settle this privately." "No," I said. "The board will be there. So will our attorneys and the forensic auditor." Daniel's face tightened at the word auditor. That reaction told me more than any confession could have. As guests began whispering, Thomas and I left through the main dining room. Outside, summer rain struck the sidewalk in silver lines. "Did you know about the amended trust?" I asked him. "There is no lawful amendment," he said. "Your father made it irrevocable. Then they forged one." Thomas did not answer immediately. "If they forged it," he finally said, "they needed access to Richard's signature, the old corporate seal, and a witness who knew the original paperwork. Only 3 living people had that access. Thomas was one, Mother was another. The third was my father's former attorney, Harold Voss. Harold had vanished from professional life 5 years earlier, after surrendering his law license. The reason had never been made public. By midnight, I knew why. One of our investigators found a payment from Daniel to a consulting company registered in Harold's daughter's name. The payment was for $80,000. It had been sent from Bennett Architectural Supply. Someone had used my electronic approval code. I did not sleep. At 6 the next morning, I entered our headquarters through the warehouse door. The building smelled of lumber, coffee, and machine oil. Those ordinary smells calmed me. This was the place I had saved. Whatever Daniel had stolen, he had not earned the loyalty inside those walls. My chief financial officer, Rosa Martinez, was waiting in my office with 2 laptops and a stack of bank records. Rosa had discovered 7 transfers disguised as consulting fees. Together they totaled $460,000. All carried my approval code. But I had approved none of them. The transfers began 3 months earlier, soon after Daniel started telling Mother he wanted to come home. "Someone cloned your credentials," Rosa said. "They also changed the notification address, so the confirmations went to an account that looks like yours." She turned the screen toward me. The fake address had been created using my name and my birth year. It was not sophisticated. It was arrogant. Daniel had counted on no one questioning a Bennett payment if a Bennett name appeared beside it. At 8:30, the board members arrived. Thomas sat at the head of the conference table, not because he wanted attention, but because the trust gave him that seat until control formally transferred to me. At 8:55, Mother walked in wearing a cream suit and carrying my father's old briefcase. Daniel followed with Harold Voss. Harold looked older than I remembered. His shoulders were bent, and sweat darkened his collar despite the cold room. Daniel placed a document on the table. It claimed Dad had amended the trust 3 days before his death. Under the amendment, Daniel would receive controlling interest upon returning to Virginia permanently. Mother would become co-trustee. My shares would be reduced to 6%. My name was misspelled in the second paragraph, Clara Bennett, the same wrong name printed on my place card the night before. I looked at Mother. She looked away. Thomas read every page before speaking. "This seal is authentic," he said. Daniel leaned back satisfied. "But the document is not." Thomas continued. He pointed to the witness line. A second witness was listed as Margaret Ellis, Dad's former assistant. Margaret had died 2 weeks before the supposed amendment date. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Harold whispered, "Daniel told me the date had been corrected." Daniel turned on him. "Be quiet." That was the moment their alliance cracked. Our attorney asked Harold whether he had witnessed Richard Bennett sign the amendment. Harold wiped his forehead. Mother said, "You do not have to answer that." He answered anyway. The word landed like a hammer. Daniel stood and accused Harold of lying. Harold shouted that Daniel had promised the document would only be used to pressure me into a settlement. Mother told them both to stop. I stayed seated. Chaos can be useful when you are the only calm person in the room. When they finally became quiet, I asked one question. "Who stole my approval code?" Daniel laughed. "You are changing the subject because you know Dad chose me." Rosa placed the transfer records on the screen. The color drained from Harold's face. Thomas explained that the company had already notified its bank, insurer, and outside counsel. No one was making a criminal accusation in that room. We were preserving evidence and allowing the proper authorities to determine what had happened. Mother stared at me with pure hatred. "You would send your own brother to prison over money." "No," I said. "Daniel may go to prison because of choices he made over money. Those are different things." Then Daniel made his second mistake. He said the transfers were loans and that Mother had authorized them. Mother turned toward him slowly. You told me they had not gone through. He realized too late what he had admitted. The room fell silent again. Their plan came out in pieces after that. Mother had taken Dad's corporate seal from a locked cabinet at the house. Harold had prepared the false amendment in exchange for $80,000. Daniel had used money stolen from the company to pay him and to cover personal debts in Chicago. They planned to present the amendment, remove me, and use company reserves to replace the stolen funds before the next annual audit. Mother insisted she had done it to restore Dad's true legacy. Thomas opened his folder one last time. Richard anticipated that excuse. He said. He removed a small digital recorder and pressed play. My father's voice filled the conference room. It was weaker than I remembered, but unmistakable. He said Daniel might someday claim that leadership was his birthright. He said Evelyn might help him because she confused protecting a child with protecting that child's worst behavior. Then Dad spoke about me. Claire will think being overlooked means she is worth less, he said. It does not. She sees what other people ignore. She stays when work becomes ugly. If she chooses the company, give her the chance to lead it. Do not give it to her as comfort. Make her earn it. Then make everyone respect what she earned. I had spent 15 years wishing my father had defended me while he was alive. Now his voice crossed all those silent years. Mother began to cry, but not with regret. She cried because the past had refused to obey her. When the recording ended, Thomas announced the trust's decisions. Daniel was permanently disqualified from holding office in the company. Mother was removed as a trust beneficiary under the fraud provision, though she would receive a modest monthly allowance that could not be borrowed against. The Monument Avenue house would return to the trust within 30 days, and full voting control of Bennett Architectural Supply would pass to me immediately. Daniel looked at me as if I had taken something from him. You set me up, he said. No, I replied. I set a table. You brought the lies. The investigation lasted 9 months. Harold cooperated almost immediately. He turned over emails, draft documents, and recordings of conversations with Daniel. In exchange for his testimony, prosecutors recommended a reduced sentence. Daniel eventually pleaded guilty to wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. He served 18 months in federal prison and was ordered to repay the company. Mother was not charged with the financial theft because the evidence showed she had not known Daniel had completed the transfers. But her role in the forged trust became part of a civil settlement. She lost the house. She lost her special income from the trust. Most painful of all, she lost the story she had told about herself, the devoted widow protecting her brilliant son. For the first time, people saw what her protection had cost everyone else. The relatives who laughed at the welcome home dinner began calling me. Some apologized. Others claimed they had always known Mother was unfair. I accepted only the apologies that contained no excuses. The rest received silence. 30 days after the board meeting, I stood in the front hall of the Monument Avenue house while Mother packed. Sunlight fell through the stained glass window Dad had installed when I was 10. I remembered sitting on those stairs as a girl while Mother drove Daniel to another tournament, another celebration, another special dinner. She had always promised she would make it up to me later. Later had finally arrived, but not in the way she expected. Where am I supposed to go? She asked. Thomas had arranged a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment near her sister. The rent was paid for 1 year. She was not being abandoned. She was being introduced to limits, I said. You have an allowance. You have more support than most people receive after attempting fraud. I am your mother. And I am your daughter. That fact never protected me. It cannot excuse you now. She sat on a moving box and studied me. I never hated you, Claire. I know. That surprised her. Hate would have required you to see me clearly. I continued. You made me small because Daniel needed to feel large. You called that love. It was not. Well, for once, she had no answer. I did not keep the house. That surprised everyone. I converted it into the Richard Bennett Center, a residence and training program for women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse. The formal dining room, where Mother had hosted Daniel's graduation parties, became a legal aid office. His bedroom became a classroom. My old room became a quiet counseling space, painted pale blue. Mother called it an insult. I called it useful. At the company, I promoted Rosa to chief operating officer and gave employees profit-sharing shares. We installed tighter financial controls so no family name, including mine, could bypass review. Within a year, revenue grew by 23%. We opened a new distribution center in North Carolina and created a paid apprenticeship program. I did not become the kind of leader Daniel had pretended to be. I did not need applause before making a decision. I did not need my name on the building. I only needed the people inside it to know their work mattered. Thomas remained chairman for one more year. On his final day, we ate lunch in the small diner across from the warehouse. I asked why he had paid for the welcome home dinner himself. He smiled. Your father left instructions for that too. He handed me a final note. Dad had written it on company stationery. If Evelyn ever gives Daniel a banquet to announce his return, let her make every speech she wants. Pay the bill. Then remind them that the person paying is not always the person showing off. I laughed until I cried. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Your father knew them, he said. But he knew you too. 3 years have passed since that dinner. Daniel now lives in Ohio and works for a small logistics firm. We do not speak often. The last time he called, he did something I never expected. He apologized without asking for money. I told him I hoped he meant it. I also told him forgiveness was not the same as restored access. Mother still sends birthday cards. She signs them "Love Mom," as if the word itself can rebuild what she broke. I answer politely. I do not visit often. Distance is not always punishment. Sometimes it is the shape peace takes after a lifetime of chaos. On the anniversary of the welcome home dinner, the Bennett Center held its first graduation ceremony. 12 women completed job training. 7 had secured permanent housing. 1 had started her own bookkeeping business. After the ceremony, a young woman named Kayla stopped me near the front stairs. She said her husband had controlled every dollar she earned. He told her she was useless, replaceable, and lucky he kept her around. I believed him, she said. Then I came here. She showed me the keys to her new apartment. In that moment, I understood that my best revenge was not taking Mother's house or Daniel's title. It was turning every weapon they had used against me into shelter for someone else. At dinner that night, I raised a glass with Thomas, Rosa, and the people who had become my chosen family. No one sat at the head of the table. No one was called a miracle. No one was called a spare. We toasted the work, the truth, and the freedom to leave old roles behind. My mother once believed power belonged to the person whose name was praised the loudest. She was wrong. Real power belonged to the person who could be humiliated in a crowded room, stand without shouting, and still know exactly who she was. I had never been the spare. I was the one holding everything together, and when I finally let go, their borrowed kingdom fell into my open hands.